Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek, where we're walking through the Bible to discover what it has to say about the end times. We call this podcast Escaping Babylon because there will be a verse later on in Revelation that is calling us out of Babylon. We are being called out of this world into new life with Jesus Christ. And that's what this is all about. And that's ultimately why we're studying the end times. It's to remind us that this story does have a climax. It does have an ending. Jesus Christ is coming back to rule and to reign, but he is also coming back to judge the earth. And when he comes back, how will he find you? Will you be known to him? Will he say, I know you? Or will he say, get out of my presence and cast you in the fiery pit? That's what this is about. It's a warning to say, listen, the gospel is this. You can't escape the wrath of God. You only do so by a relationship with Jesus Christ. Are you known by Jesus? Now today I'm excited because we're diving into Revelation chapter 6, where we're finally going to be unleashing the 6 to 7 seals. We're only going to cover about 4 of them today, so hang on for the ride. And those 4, many of you know, are affectionately called as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So I'm looking forward to dive into that. But a warning before we get there, if we could, as we start studying some of these signs and wonders and the judgments being passed, it can be easy to fall into despair. There is a lot of death. There is a lot of destruction that is going to happen. Some say that, for instance, in the seals, it indicates that 1/4 of the Earth's population is killed. We know for sure from the trumpets that 1/3 of the population is removed from the earth. And this can seem like enormous. You start thinking, well, what is the population of the earth currently? What does that mean? Well, let's put it in perspective. The current population of the world is about 7.9 billion right now, and I'm just going to go ahead and round up to 8 for easy math here. If we said, well, 1/4 of the Earth's population was removed, that would be 2 billion people. 8 divided by 4 equals 2. 8 minus 2 then, those 2 billion removed, leaves us at 6 billion. And then we move into the trumpets that would say, well, then it's another 1/3 of the population. And so 6 divided by 3 is 2 billion as well. So we have another 2 billion people that have been removed from the earth. We add those two together, 2 billion plus 2 billion. We now have 4 billion people that have lost their lives. Subtract that from the original number of 8 billion, and you can see that when it's said and done, there'd only be about 4 billion people remaining. And we can see that and go, wow, that's just enormous. That's a huge number, and it is. But it's not the first time in human history that we have seen wholesale destruction of this type. Immediately, I start thinking of the Black Death during medieval times. It was a highly contagious disease carried by rats from Asia, and it came to Sicily around 1347. The disease spread quickly through Europe. In fact, researchers guess that nearly 40% of the European population was wiped out by the Black Death. The best guesses, they say, is that somewhere around 25 to 40 million people. This had a devastating impact on the society. For instance, there were food shortages, price hikes during this time. There was a breakdown of law and order. Communities were torn completely apart, families torn apart, and some areas were transformed into ghost towns because of it. The economic effects of the Black Death were severe. It wasn't just that people died of the Black Death, it was how it affected, like a domino, all the other structures of society as well. Manufacturing output declined by 50% during this time, and food production stalled. Let's look at the first seal. Revelation chapter 6, verse 1. It says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. All right, the first thing we need to know about seal 1 is of all the seals, this one can be the most ambiguous. On this one, we're just told there's a rider, he's given a bow and a crown, and he rides out to be like a conqueror bent on conquest. What does that even mean? And many guesses have been made. And I'll tell you, by far, the most common guess for this is that it is this person we know in the end times narrative called the Antichrist. And the answer is it's quite possible that's who it is, but that doesn't mean A, that's for sure who it is, or B, that's all it is. And so let's look at it with bigger eyes. What is it possibly saying here? And the problem is if we use Matthew 24 as our guide, which we're going to, Jesus warns of two different sets of people or two different individuals. And Jesus also said there will be false teachers and false prophets, and that's the one we often ignore. And yet when you really look at the Revelation story, this false prophet and this false Messiah are in many ways teamed together. And we need to pay attention to both. They each have a function, they each have a reason, and they both cause destruction in different ways. To ignore the false prophet is to not understand the story of the end times and possibly to be deceived. So let's pay attention to that. Jesus warned that in the end, there would be false messiahs and false teachers. If that's true and that's what's being unleashed here, then what we're going to end up seeing is that the second seal, third seal, fourth seal are all escalations of these two people and their campaigns against the earth. In fact, the fifth we will see is his persecution against God's people. What's another idea of this white horse? Well, others state that this is Christianity. This represents the Christian church as it expands over the centuries to cover the globe, to cover the earth, to take the message of Jesus across the earth. But I don't know that that's going to be a correct understanding, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. Another one is historians look to the current times of the Apostle John and say, no, what this is the Parthian Empire. Now, a lot of people don't know about these people, but what you should know is that this was Rome's nemesis at this time. We like to think that Rome had conquered the entire world and they didn't have enemies and they didn't fight, but they did. They had some very real enemies on their borders. One of them was the Parthian Empire that caused them trouble all the time. What is interesting about this group of people is where they occupy today. Today, this empire would engulf countries that we know such as Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And what's interesting is all of these are largely Muslim countries today. The Parthian Empire was known for their fighting style. It was fierce. The Romans had a hard time defending it, and that's why they were so feared. Their fighting styles, they fought on horses. They were excellent with bows and enormously effective. And this was difficult for the Roman army, which largely just put their soldiers up in a long line with their spears and with their shields and marched forward. But these horses would just go right through the line and devastate them. And so these two groups, the Romans and the Parthians, fought all the time. Another choice that people will say for the white horse is the gospel. This is the gospel advancing through the earth. And just like to say, hey, no, this is the church being spread throughout the earth, I don't think this represents the gospel being advanced throughout the earth either. And here's why. When we look at the other seals and we see them in context, all of them typically represent something negative or something in judgment of the current earth. In other words, one sends war, one sends pestilence, another sends inflation. You see what I mean? It's like each of them are actually appear to be judgments on the earth. And I don't think he's going to send the church and the gospel out as judgment on the earth. This would represent, and to keep in line with the overall theme and the feel of this chapter, he is sending out something that is in judgment of the earth. And so it's hard to believe that the first one would be a positive result when the other ones clearly bring death and destruction on the planet. Therefore, this most likely represents both of what Jesus said. It is false messiahs and false prophets, two beasts. is what it will be called in the book of Revelation. We look at Matthew 24:4, Jesus says, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many." In verse 11, what does he say? He says, "Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." So we got two different groups of people here. It shouldn't be strange to see that suddenly we see the same thing in the book of Revelation, only we learn more. In Revelation 13, for instance, we'll see the dragon, which is Satan, stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon, Satan, gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it?" And last in the same chapter, verse 11, it says, "Then I saw a second beast," so beast number 2, "coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed." So for many people, they say, well, yeah, the first one sounds like the Antichrist, and it does by many definitions, but I need to remind us of something here. The book of Revelation does not use the title Antichrist anywhere in it. It does not exist. It refers to these beasts in 2 different ways, and this is so important to understanding and reading Scripture, and this happens in other parts of Scripture as well. The beast can be 2 different things. It is clearly a set of empires, successive empires, and we'll look at that here in a second, but it can also represent a person. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, people can often be aligned with an empire. For instance, when we say ancient Greece conquered the world, right away, what's the name that comes to mind? And we say Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is tied to Greece. In our modern times, I think the best example we can give would be 100 years ago in Germany. A man with a funny mustache created a movement too that was enormously destructive, started World War II, and was responsible for the death of over 6 million Jews. And we know who that man is. And so, this first horse going out is not so much a person as it is a movement. It is an empire, an oppressive force that comes out of the sea, as Revelation says. It is a kingdom, and it's defined by a leopard, a bear, and a lion. And what you need to know is that is absolute imagery from Daniel. We've looked at the book of Daniel many times, understanding that Jesus referenced Daniel several times in Matthew 24. The book of Revelation is going to reference Daniel several times. And so Daniel, Matthew 24, and the book of Revelation are all tied together. Let's look at Daniel real quick. Chapter 7, it says, "The first was a lion." He's talking about a beast that he saw in a vision. And in that beast, he saw a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being. And the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me then was a second beast. This one looked like a bear. And it raised up one of its sides, and there it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up, eat your fill of flesh." And after that, I looked, and there before me was another beast. This one looked like a leopard. And on its back, it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given the authority to rule. Now, for various reasons, and we've talked about this in past podcasts, so I'm not going to go there today, but experts have assigned empires to each of these animals. The lion with wings, for instance, was Babylon, As we have unearthed and done archaeological studies on ancient Babylon, statues show lions with wings. This represents Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, love, and war. But if you go to even the modern-day gates and ruins of ancient Babylon, you will see these lions with wings all over the place. It was clearly representing ancient Babylon. The bear replaced Babylon, and this was the Assyrian Empire, which conquered even more earth than the Babylon Empire did. And then after that was replaced by the leopard, which was ancient Greece and Alexander the Great. So we can see that what's being referenced in Revelation is clearly a look back to Daniel, and we see alignment between these two scriptures: lions, bears, leopards, beasts, which represent empires and represent kingdoms. What we're seeing in this first horse is a kingdom. And you say, well, it could be the Antichrist. I agree. Good chance this kingdom is ruled by a very famous, powerful warlord called the Antichrist. But there's also, Jesus warned us of a false prophet who will demand worship of this person. And what I'd say is, don't think too small of the seal. I think the seal represents this kingdom, this empire, of which, yes, I think the Antichrist is hanging out somewhere in there, and the false prophet is in there as well. And notice it said in there, who can face this person? Who can defeat them? Clearly a powerful warlord that is winning wars and taking ground. This is what we're to be looking for. Okay, so where does this idea of the Antichrist, this warlord, this person that seems to be at the center of the end time story, where does the idea of this come from? Well, many parts of Scripture, for instance, Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, he says, don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day, what is he talking about? The day of the Lord will not come until the rebellion occurs. What rebellion? Well, Jesus talks about this in Matthew 24, so it's not a new concept, but the actual word there is apostasy. There seems to be some indication that something happens in the church of Christ. There is a rebellion there, and that's one of the signs before the man of lawlessness is revealed. This is the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple and proclaims himself to be God. So we see there's this individual who comes out of an apostasy. He is arrogant. He will oppose others, exalt himself over God, speak blasphemies to God, demand worship. In fact, he sets himself up in God's temple in some way and proclaims himself to be God. Daniel talks about a little horn. In verse 11, he says, I continue to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. This caught Daniel's attention. What is this horn? Who is this person? What is this thing? In verse 20, he continues to see it. He says, I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on the head of the beast and the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. This unique horn that had boastful words looked more imposing than the others, and it had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. He then is given an explanation by the angel, and it says the 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So again, he's noticing, what does the beast represent? It represents a kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier one. So there seems to be some successive kings and then another one. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half times. And we've seen that language before. A time, and a half times. What is that? 3.5 years. What does he mean when he's saying he's going to change the set times and the laws? We don't know for sure, but let me give you an example. Let's say that this empire, for instance, represented a Muslim caliphate. Well, what do? They would impose Sharia law. That would certainly be a unique set of laws that are different than the rest of the world. They would remove many of the feasts and the festivals other countries are partaking in. For instance, in Israel, that would be the removal of Jewish feasts and festivals, and they would replace them with their feasts and festivals, things like Ramadan. They would replace the calendar with the Arabic calendar, which is a lunar calendar in which they base those feasts and those festivals on. All of this would be changing the times and the laws. It would be unique to everyone. Okay, let's keep going. What are some things we notice from this first seal? Well, first, the white horse, right? What would we know about white horses in first century Rome? Well, number one, they were highly valued in John's time. They were for royalty or for special people. So we talked before once about purple and wearing purple garments and how difficult that is to make from snails and how expensive it was. These white horses, purebred white horses, were the same thing. They represent people of privilege and power, usually used for royalty or special people. The second thing we notice is this bow. Now, the bow in ancient texts represents conquering, as opposed to the sword, which represents war, and we'll see that in the next seal. The bow is unique in that it represents conquering. Either way, these are weapons of warfare. But notice there is no mention of arrows. And so there's this sense of conquering without war. He does through diplomacy, peace treaties, alliances, politics, and intrigue. It says that he's wearing a crown, but what we need to know is, and we've talked about this before, there were two different words for crown during this time. There's one that's called a diadem, and that is a ruler's crown. The second is a Stephanos, which is a victor's crown. It was given to winners of a race. It was a wreath or a garland of various shapes and materials, often made of leaves and twigs, flowers, sometimes even metal. But it was a sign of victory, honor, and in some contexts, limited authority. But by and large, it was given to the winner of a race. Now, it's hard to ignore the comparison with Jesus later in Revelation. What do I mean by that? Well, this isn't the only white horse we're going to see in the book of Revelation. For instance, in Revelation 19, it says, I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. But the crowns in this case are diadems. In the rider in the first seal, it was Stephanos. So there are different crowns here. And notice also this rider, which is Jesus, by the way, has many crowns, many diadems. He is the ruler of all nations. But it's hard to ignore that there's some similarity here. And this is why people often relate the first seal to the Antichrist. Why? They say it is a false representation of the future Christ who's coming with diadems to conquer the earth. This one is a false Messiah, a mock-up. And while I think that there's probably some good reasoning on that, I think it's limiting to say that the first one is the Antichrist only. I believe this first seal is the empire or the kingdom of this Antichrist, and do not ignore the false prophet either. I'll say that many times. Do not ignore this false prophet and what their part of the story. Jesus mentions false teachers and false prophets in Matthew 24, and John would have been aware of this. I want to remind you that Jesus was talking to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse. John was one of his disciples, so he would have been there. He would have been relating back to, I remember Jesus saying this, and now I relate it to what he's showing me in this vision here. These two stories would have been playing in his mind. And Jesus warned, there's a false Messiah, there's a false ruler, and then there is a false religion with a false prophet to conquer the world as well. Now, is there any religion like that out there? A religion looking for a leader that will unite them and lead them into a golden age, that will conquer the earth, that believes, for instance, that Jesus is coming back to serve that leader as well, and that together they have a desire to conquer the world in their God's name. And yes, that religion is called Islam, the people of the prophet. We've done videos on this too. Very clearly, Islam is awaiting what they call the Mahdi. It's a messianic deliverer. He will restore true religion. He will fill the earth with Islamic justice and equity, and he will usher in a short golden age before the end of the world. It surprises a lot of people to understand that they also believe in Isa of Maryam, which is Jesus of Mary, and that he will come back. They do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. They believe he was delivered before all of that happened, that he is awaiting his time in heaven to come back to serve the Mahdi. He will perform a prayer behind the Mahdi, showing that he serves the Mahdi and is second to the Mahdi, and that he has allegiance to the Mahdi. That's how the story goes. So built right into the Muslim end-time story, there is a world leader, a Messiah called the Mahdi, and there is a false Jesus, a false prophet named Isa. Is there another possibility out there? And the answer is yes, but this one's more vague. As they have uncovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've learned that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain references from the ancient Jewish sects of two messiahs. One is a king and one is a priest. They talk about a Messiah of David, a kingly figure who will lead a war and sit on a throne, and they talk about a Messiah of Aaron, a priestly figure who will restore the temple in Jerusalem and act as a spiritual counselor. In the Manual of Discipline, it explicitly states the idea of two messiahs. It says, they shall be judged by the first statutes by which the community members were ruled at first, until there shall come the prophet and the Messiah of Aaron and of Israel. So of the three major religions in the world, two are awaiting messiahs and teachers. You have to choose, which one do we think, if we're living in those times, and we could see that happen not only in our lifetime, but maybe in our children's lifetime, which one of these two groups probably is most likely to latch on to this world ruler and a false prophet? And so I don't believe this first seal is pointing strictly to simply an antichrist here. And remember, antichrist isn't even mentioned in Revelation, but I believe it's representing a beast that many times is referred to as the Antichrist. Sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's an empire. We need to keep that in mind as we read the story. Let's go to the second seal now. Verse 3, it says, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard a second living creature say, come. And there another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. Again, we've seen wholesale destruction like this happen before. We've seen the world at war. In the 20th century, we lived through 2 world wars, and the world was in a constant state of war throughout the entire century. We've seen incredible conquerors in the past. Again, Genghis Khan, responsible for the death of 40 to 60 million people, about 10% of the world's population, was killed. And Genghis Khan had the largest land empire in history. Oftentimes people say, oh, wasn't that the Roman Empire? No, actually, Genghis Khan's land, the amount of geography that he occupied, was much larger than the Roman Empire. The Caliphate, which replaced Rome, also conquered Byzantine later, had an enormous land empire as well. We look at some other rulers out there. We look at Stalin and the effects he had on Russia, and we also look at Mao and China, both responsible for millions of people who have passed away. However, whatever's happening here in this seal is supposed to be shocking. It's intensified. It's escalating. It is in an unprecedented scale like we have never seen before. And you just think back to the 2 world wars and just some of the other stories, Genghis Khan, things like that. Like, my goodness, what in the world does this war look like? And so there's a very good chance that this empire or movement of the first horse is now in the second seal moving into a violent conquering mode to establish themselves as world rulers through force. All right, the third seal. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. And I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what sounded like a voice amongst the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, but do not damage the oil and the wine. What are we seeing with this seal? We are seeing inflation, we are seeing scarcity, and hunger. Poverty, in other words. Now, what are some facts on poverty? Just kind of put this in perspective today. Well, according to many sources, 648 million people live in extreme poverty throughout the earth. They survive on less than $2.15 a day. It's said that 1 in 3 children in low and middle class income countries suffers from chronic undernutrition. And what's interesting, this caught me off guard, half of the world's poorest people live in 5 countries. It's Bangladesh, the DRC, Ethiopia, India, and Nigeria. For most countries, the average proportion of income spent on food, particularly in poor countries, is about 2/3. In other words, 2/3 of whatever money is brought into the house is spent on food. Now, compare that, for instance, with countries like America and Europe, where that ratio is around 25%. About 1/4 of what comes in goes towards food. 356 million children live in extreme poverty around the world. In 2022, there were 2.4 billion people, that's 29.6% of the population of the earth, who were moderately or severely food insecure. In other words, they didn't have access to enough food or nutrients. This is 391 million people more than in the year 2019 and 745 million more than 2015. So this rate of poverty is growing throughout the earth at the moment. Now, this seal is a little harder to understand at first because we don't necessarily go out and buy wheat, make bread every day, don't necessarily have an understanding of what it's saying here. And keep in mind, there's a very good chance that this scarcity, this inflation and starvation is a result of the wars of the second seal. We often see those things go together. War causes scarcity. They destroy crops, they disrupt trade, they cause inflation. And so this seal is about famine and scarcity. This can allow this world ruler to control food prices and determine who gets how much and when. Ultimately, control. Further and further control of the people. The balance this person's holding was commonly used in marketplaces at the time. They would weigh out the amount of food one can buy with each, with their money. It talks about a denarius, and it's important to understand that a denarius represents 1 day's wage throughout the New Testament. So a denarius would feed a family. A quart of wheat would feed a single worker often for a day to give them enough calories. A quart equals about 1.1 pounds. So it's talking about a day's wage for 2 pounds here, and that would make sense. It would feed a worker, but it would not feed a family. So if you had a family to support, they would also buy barley, which is cheaper than wheat. It was rougher. It changed the texture and the taste of bread. And it was oftentimes harder to digest, but it's what people who didn't have a lot of money would buy in order to get more calories. What we need to understand in perspective is that here, the grain costs at least 5 to 8 times the normal amount. That's inflation. And so I just think even in comparison where I live, people are complaining, for instance, that eggs are up 50%, milk is up 40% in the last 2 or 3 years. People are paying $6 for bacon. Imagine paying 5 times as much for stuff that you have to get from the grocery store. Imagine paying $20 for a dozen eggs, $22 for a gallon of milk, or 30 pounds for some bacon. How would you feel about that? And I would say most of us, that would be a burden on our income and feeding our family. And so the main idea in this seal is that the average person doesn't make enough to put food on the table during this time. This will lead to malnutrition and starvation, and families often will maybe have to decide who eats and who doesn't eat, but there's not enough to go around. What's interesting is it highlights the oil and the wine. Now, in ancient Rome, in many ways as it is today, these were luxuries for the wealthy. And what's seen here is that there's a clear divide between what we call the haves, the wealthy, and the have-nots, the poor. And we see today that the divide between the rich and the common people is just growing and growing and growing. But what's important here is, of course, in this times, while others are struggling, the rich and the powerful, they'll be taken care of. It will not be a problem for them. This was not uncommon in John's time. The wine trade was more profitable than grain. And I think that's probably true today. It seems like in my grocery store, you walk by the wine section or look in the liquor store, it's just full of wine bottles, and some are so expensive. And farmers during Roman times in Roman provinces would stop growing grain and they would start growing grapes to make wine because they knew they would make more money. And that would create a shortage, which would create inflation and drive up prices. In fact, we even see stories from the Emperor Domitian during this time. He tried to restrict vine production in places throughout Asia, and his attempts proved to be unpopular and unsuccessful because people wanted to make money off the wine. The fourth seal. In verse 7, it says, "When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come.' I looked, and before me was a pale horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, by famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth." All right, there's a lot to unpack in these verses, so let's get started. There's a pale horse in verse 8. This could very easily be translated a green horse. The word here used for pale was chloros. It's where we get our word chlorophyll from, which is a green pigment found in the chloroplasts of plants and algae that gives them their green color. But the term, when applied to complexion, simply means pale. It symbolizes death. It's the look of someone who has passed away. And this is usually from the result of plague and sickness. Again, yes, I think that these seals can be culminating upon each other. In other words, you have this empire come out. This empire then wages war. That war leads to inflation and scarcity, which also leads to death and destruction by disease. And to be sure, we see in that verses the expression that they were given authority to kill, which suggests intention. It doesn't mean that this intention is accomplished, though. The book of Revelation will actually state that a massive number of people have killed, but in the end, this will be limited. Even Jesus would tell us that he would cut short the end times for the elect. In the end, God is still ultimately in control. The one I want to look at here is where it says, "and wild beasts." And here I do believe we have a mystery here, and a lot of other scholars do as well. I don't think, and many don't think, that this is an accurate translation of the verse. Here's why. The term for beast is therion in the ancient Greek. And what you need to know is it's used 39 times in the book of Revelation. And in every instance, except here, it seems for scholars, but in the other 38 times, it refers to the Antichrist or the beast. That beast we talked about, that empire, that kingdom, and his associates. The definite article before therion used here in chapter 6 is ho. And I don't want to get into how ancient Greek works, but what you have to know is it's like in the English language when we put the before something. It literally means the beast, not beasts, as it indicates here by the translation. This supports the view, then, of how it should be used the other 38 times in Revelation. In other words, it's referring to the beast here, not necessarily just beasts of the field, wild animals. It's referring to this end times beast empire. It's referring to the movement that is conquering the earth. And so a better rendering of this passage would be, they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the beast, this empire, this kingdom, this world ruler and his false prophet. And so we'll see later that the beast is responsible also for putting Christians to death, that he was given authority to kill, which means he has intentionality. That is his purpose. That's what he was sent to do. Now let's look at the fourth of the earth piece. And I stated earlier that there's a lot of scholars that say, well, then they were given permission to kill a fourth of the population of the earth. But read the verse closely. It does not say that. And we have to ask ourselves here whether this is geographic or demographic, because it's not clear. If it's geographic, then he is given authority of 1/4 of the geography of the world. If it's demographic, then it would be 1/4 of the population. We need to be cautious, though, about jumping to conclusions. It is not clear here which one it is. It could just be geographic, that he was given authority to rule over 1/4 of the earth, to cause war and famine and pestilence to happen in 1/4 of the earth. To give you some perspective about how big 1/4 of the earth, though, would be, Russia, for instance, takes up about 11% of the earth's landmass. If you were to look at the entirety of North and South America, that would represent about 1/4 of the landmass. So this is an enormous, if he's talking about geography, this is an enormous landmass, an enormous area he's talking about. If he's talking about population, he's talking about 2 billion people who lose their lives. But as you can see, these seals mirror Revelation chapter 4. As we come to the end of the 4 horsemen, we see false messiahs and false prophets. We see wars and rumors of wars. We see famines. But real quick, I just want to kind of show a chart before we end our time here together today. Let's look at how Matthew 24 compares to the book of Revelation, particularly the seals. We see, for instance, in Matthew 24, starting in verse 4, he talks about Antichrist and false Christ. In verse 11, he would then talk about false prophets. And we see the first seal being unleashed. He will talk about wars and rumors of wars, and we see in the second seal that's exactly what happens. He talks about famine, and we see that in the third seal, that's what's being shown to us. What we'll see next in the next seal is martyrdom, and he'll talk about a great tribulation, which is also mentioned in the book of Daniel. We'll see that in the fourth seal. We'll see the results of that martyrdom in the fifth seal, and then we will be shown in the sixth seal celestial disturbances. Jesus spoke about those in verse 29 of Matthew 24. He talks about, or the moon even being turned to blood. The sun is darkened. The stars fall from the sky. We'll see very similar language used in the sixth seal here. Jesus then in verse 30-31 talks about a gathering, a capturing up of the saints. We will see in an interlude section, you'll see as we get to chapter 7, after 6, there's this interlude between the sixth seal and the seventh seal. And there we are given a picture of a number of people beyond even counting of raptured saints. And so, yes, it is discussed. What isn't discussed, and the part that becomes difficult for people, is if these are sequential and if they're in order, this is much further down in the story than many believe. It is after the return of Jesus and the signs in the sky that the saints are raptured to be with him. And then we are shown from the seventh seal the day of the Lord's wrath, and then the peace that comes after it. So you can see that there is a lot of alignment between what Jesus says in Matthew 24 and these first seals that are being opened. We're going to continue that discussion next week as we look at the fifth, sixth, seventh seal and what they mean leading up into the 7 trumpets. So I hope you're enjoying the conversation. I hope this has been thought-provoking for you, maybe even challenging for you in certain areas that you stood on to say, I'm absolutely certain this is what it means, but boy, that's not necessarily aligning with what Scripture says. May we hold to what Scripture says. Let's not add to it. Let's not take away. Let's be willing to relook at some things that we have come to accept are true, but didn't necessarily do any research on. There's so many people I know and say, it's exactly how this end time story is going to play out because that's what my relatives said, that's what the book I said, that's what the movie I saw said. We need to be good stewards of the Bible, to read what it has to say, to pray about it, to think about it, take that to Scripture and look at other books, commentaries, things of that nature, and ask ourselves, is this really saying what I think it's saying? Does this measure correctly to the story that I've held to, or do I need to rethink some things in my life? Because again, Jesus told us to be watching and ready, and he told us about many of these things, about persecutions and about awaiting, about persevering through it. He told us those for a reason. That no time did Jesus look at this group of people he was talking to in either Matthew 24 and Revelation and say, hey guys, don't worry about it. Before things get really bad, you're out of here. No, there seems to be a promise in here, and I'm sorry, that we will face difficult times. There will be rebellion and apostasy, followed by persecution, followed by starvation, followed by a mark that people will have to decide to take or not, that could result into all the other things happening as well. Are we ready for those times? Will you persevere? Because that is the message of Jesus. For those who persevere, they will be saved. Hey, if you like what you hear, let's hit subscribe, hit like, leave helpful comments, and appreciate you listening in. Get the word out there, tell others about it, and we'll see you next week. Remember, Jesus is coming back, and he is the hope for salvation. I love you. Bye-bye.